The Doomsday Clock has reached the closest ever point to midnight. That is according to the atomic scientists who run it. They say more wars and aggression involving nuclear powers and weaker arms controls are to blame, along with climate change and risks posed by artificial intelligence. So how worried should we be? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. The Doomsday Clock has been around since the start of the Cold War. It's a barometer of the world's health as seen by atomic scientists and other experts. Hitting midnight means the end for humanity and the world as we know it. And we're closer to that point than ever this year, according to the body that manages the clock, which is the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, founded by Albert Einstein and others at the end of World War II. The experts who run this clock blame more wars and aggression involving nuclear powers and worsening international relations as factors. Climate change and AI are in there too, posing global risks. But just how accurate is the Doomsday Clock in telling us the true state of dangers to the world and humankind? Should we be worried? We'll discuss all this with our guests shortly. First, this report from Alexandra Byers.
The determination of the Bulletin's Science and Security.
The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says the world is the closest it's ever been to the total annihilation of humanity as it advanced the so-called Doomsday Clock to 85 seconds to midnight.
The risks we face from nuclear weapons, climate change, and disruptive technologies are all growing. Every second counts, and we are running out of time.
The concept of the clock was created in 1947, shortly after the development of the atomic bomb. It began at 7 minutes to midnight and has moved back and forth through wars, crises, and arms treaties. The safest moment was in 1991, when the end of the Cold War pushed the clock back 17 minutes to midnight. But in recent years, the group has moved from counting down the minutes to counting down the seconds. And now, it's the closest it's ever been to midnight.
Conflicts intensified in 2025, with multiple military operations involving nuclear-armed states. The last remaining treaty governing nuclear weapon stockpiles between the U.S. and Russia expires next week. For the first time in over half a century, there will be nothing preventing a runaway nuclear arms race.
The group cites the war in Ukraine, attacks on Iran, conflict between India and Pakistan, and the rise of autocratic leaders around the world. But also the threats posed by new technology, like the increasing use of artificial intelligence without adequate controls.
We are living through an information Armageddon. That's brought about by the technology that rules our lives, from social media to generative AI. None of that tech is anchored in facts. Your chatbot is nothing but a probabilistic machine.
It also points to increasing natural disasters linked to climate change and how governments continue to fail to agree on meaningful action to fight it. But the group made clear the possibility of destruction is caused by humans and can be solved by humans.
The tools needed to reduce these existential threats exist. What we lack is international cooperation, political courage, and a global citizen call to action.
They say the clock has moved away from midnight in the past, and it can and must do so again. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests. Karim Haggag is director at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and he joins us from the Swedish capital. Ramesh Srinivasan is professor at the UCLA Department of Information Studies and host of the podcast Utopias. Ramesh joins us from Los Angeles. Ben Aris is in Berlin, and he is the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. A warm welcome to all of you, gentlemen. I want to start with going to all of you very briefly right at the top, if I might, just to ask you this. Is there anyone who disagrees with this assessment that's been made that we are at 85 seconds to midnight. Ramesh, you got a pre-dawn for us, so you start.
I don't necessarily disagree. I don't have the specifics on how the atomic scientists break everything down, but I do think that we are staring at a number of interlinked global crises that are critical for global leadership at a time we see more and more authoritarian and nationalist and autocratic leadership.
Hey, Karim, when you look at your watch, does it say 85 seconds to midnight? Is this the most dangerous? What that translates as is this is the most dangerous the world has ever been and closest to the end of the planet as we know it since almost 80 years.
So exactly, the way we should read the clock is not necessarily the way we would read our wristwatch, as it were. The Doomsday Clock is a very powerful visual device that is meant to capture the level of existential risk. So rather than maybe take issue with how many seconds we are away from midnight, what we can safely assume is that the level of these existential risks is increasing. And that goes back to all of the factors that were mentioned in the introduction to your segment, the level of nuclear dangers, environmental dangers, technological dangers. So yes, we are getting closer to midnight, as it were. How exactly close or far we are from that is not a matter of seconds, but a matter of an overall trend.
Ben?
I grew up in the Cold War era, and in those days, a lot of the threats were sort of very general. The standoff between the Soviet Union and the West, but in those days also we had all the armed security deals, and what we've changed to now is it all become very specific. These threats, specifically the nuclear threat. We actually Putin, who is rattling his nuclear saber and moving nuclear missiles into Belarus, and has upgraded or changed the Russian nuclear policy to allow first strikes. And this never existed when I was a kid. It was just, generally that we had, 3,000 missiles and they had 3,000 missiles. And on things like the climate crisis, and when I was a kid, it was global warming. And now we've got an accelerated climate crisis where we're actually missing the target set in Paris. And the same with biological threats, which is another factor. I mean, we used to suffer from flu in the autumn, but then we all lived through the pandemic of 2020 that kills people. And there's a new virus that's now doing the rounds in India that kills 40 to 75% of its victims, because the human race, we've grown to such a large pool that nature's now taking advantage of that, and viruses are the one thing we as a species remain vulnerable. So if anything, I think they're underestimating the threats simply because they're now identifiably specific of actually how these things are going to come and get us as a species.
The first big threat that this report mentions is the nuclear threat. And Karim, I'll come to you for that. I should mention, for the benefit of our viewers, that you're also a member of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament, and you're a specialist in arms control and nuclear non-proliferation. What is the doomsday nuclear scenario? Let's start there. What does that actually look like today in 2026?
The doomsday nuclear scenario would involve, at a minimum, the actual use of nuclear weapons in the context of armed conflict. So for the first time since 1945, the first and only time when atomic weapons have been used in the context of major war, that could potentially set off a chain of escalation that can broaden to include a widespread use of nuclear weapons. And given everything we know about the effects of these weapons, the effects in terms of the scale of destruction, the environmental effects, which are no less serious, and just the general disruption and
Karim, I'm afraid to ask, but can you lay that out for us? The scale of destruction. What is that? What is the scale of nuclear destruction that we could potentially face if somebody pulls the trigger?
So we have a situation now in which, compared to the atomic weapons that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War in 1945, the strategic nuclear weapons that exist today, they multiply the effects of the destruction that was visited then on these Japanese cities by an order of magnitude between 500 and 600. And so we are looking at an existential level, potentially disrupting global climate, global communications, let alone the mass death that would result as the result of the use of these weapons. So we are looking at, yes, an actual doomsday scenario when it comes to the widespread use of these weapons in the context of a future armed conflict.
Ramesh, you, in preparation for this program, wrote to our team something that I found really interesting, where you framed it in a way that I think is really helpful. You said there's a lower threshold to take a step that would create some sort of mass event, such as a nuclear strike. Can you expand on that?
Yes, absolutely. So, many of the systems and ways in which we're living around the world are interlinked. We saw during the pandemic, for example, how climate change issues and pandemic issues were actually tied to one another because of human habitation where human beings live. We're seeing artificial intelligence and technologies incredibly deleterious, I would say even disastrous impacts on environmental issues and economic security issues. So the point I was trying to make is different domains that we might think of as separate, even including nuclear proliferation and nuclear conflict, are all connected, because nuclear conflict, of course, and the possibility of that is increased when we don't have strong global governance that could rein in people like Putin and increasingly other autocrats who have access to nuclear weapons, including our own administration here in the United States. So the instability of global order, right? Mark Carney himself was speaking about this not long ago in Davos. It's gotten a lot of attention. The instability of global order means it doesn't take a lot of slipping up to create chain effects that could be disastrous on a larger scale. So that's why more than ever, we need to recognize the world is incredibly globalized, right? But we need global governance, and there needs to be more sovereignty and power in global bodies like the United Nations. Otherwise, we're going to get these sort of renegade types of proposals like the Board of Peace that Trump raised in Davos just last week.
I've got some questions later on the eroding safety net of multilateralism and specifically the UN. I want to stick to the nuclear issue for a moment longer. Ben, ever since the end of the Cold War, early 90s, there has been a series of treaties between the world's two largest nuclear powers, the US and Soviet Union at the time, on the goal of which was to limit their nuclear arsenal. So limit the number of nuclear warheads, limit the number of delivery systems, which for everybody at home mean the missiles on which you put those warheads to actually fire them. So limit the nuclear arsenal and the ability to actually strike with it. And that the last of those treaties, which is called New START, expires February 4th, days from now. How concerned are you?
Very. You put your finger on what for me is the scariest aspect of it all. It goes right back to 1972 when Nixon and I think it was Brezhnev, they signed the beginning of this infrastructure, starting with the anti-ballistic missile, the ABM treaty. And that has been in place throughout the Cold War. And ironically, because of those treaties, the standoff ended up being stable. And what's happened starting in 2002 when Bush unilaterally nixed the ABM treaty is all of those, that whole infrastructure, security, arms control infrastructure, including inspections, etc., has all been dismantled. Every single one of those treaties has been undone, except the New START. That was signed, it was the first thing that Biden did when he came in 2021. And Putin leapt at the opportunity that, ironically, the Russians want to put all that stuff back in place because it brings a stability, a standoff, if you like. But that expires next week. And once that's gone, as one of the scientists said in your report in the run-up, is that we're facing the possibility of a runaway nuclear arms race restarting. So we're now into with much more powerful weapons than existed in the Second World War. So we're now facing the possibility of not just a runaway nuclear buildup between America and Russia specifically, But one of the ironies of the Ukraine conflict is that the West has been limiting the amount of arms it gives to Ukraine because the possibility if Ukraine wins is the so-called escalation strategy by the West. If Ukraine wins, then Russia's threatening to use a small tactical nuclear weapon to end the war. It could blow up just, half of Kiev with one of these things. And everyone else is looking at that and seeing that Ukraine is not being supported by the West. What that does is encourages nuclear proliferation for someone like Iran, who's just been attacked and had a war with Israel last year. But the Americans flew side by side with the Israelis in that war, and they're not putting in that kind of weapons. They're not flying side by side with the Ukrainians because of Russia's nuclear weapons. So someone like Iran will want to get a bomb in order to prevent that. Someone like North Korea has already got one and has therefore insured itself against attack. And so there's now this push not only to have unregulated nuclear weapons, but all the other countries, rogue countries, are now encouraged by the Ukraine war to also develop nuclear weapons. So we're getting into a more and more unstable situation where we see more and more crazy countries getting the bomb and threatening to use it.
You just said a word I'm interested in. You said crazy countries. I wanted to ask you, Karim, a question about sanity. This is a really, forgive me if it's a naive question, but sanity is supposed to be the linchpin of nuclear deterrence, right? That if you're in your right mind, you don't start nuclear escalation because nobody wins. Do you think that is less true today in 2026 than there is less sanity today than there was perhaps decades ago?
Well, sanity is a very, elusive concept to grapple with. But the basic premise of arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation is that all weapons are bad. There are no good nuclear weapons versus bad nuclear weapons. All of them are bad. And so the less nuclear weapons we have, the less proliferation of these weapons, the less operational readiness of these weapons, the more safer the overall global security environment. So it's really a false distinction to make between nuclear weapons that are safe in one particular pair of hands versus another. So what we need in order to begin to move the clock back from doomsday is a very concerted effort to rebuild the architecture of arms control that, as Ben mentioned, has rightly mentioned, has been breaking down over the course of the last 2 decades. So more controls on nuclear weapons, getting back to a situation where we have deep cuts in the overall number of nuclear weapons, reinforcing the global non-proliferation regime. But that, of course, gets to the broader point you are making about the erosion of multilateralism in general. So all of this architecture and the non-proliferation regime is embedded in the overall structure of global multilateralism. So that has been fraying, again, over the course of the last few years due to a whole host of factors. So this is a very multi-pronged problem that we have to address. But we have to get back to a system that begins to put these limitations back into place to reduce the overall number of nuclear weapons and reduce the overall dangers associated with these weapons.
So the report, the Doomsday Clock, also mentions climate change and artificial intelligence as major threats. Ramesh, I know you're very present in the AI space. You've written about this, talked about this. So I want to ask you about this. The report mentions AI as a threat in 3 distinct ways. Because AI could be used in the military and defense industry, specifically in command and control structures. That means the decision makers' decisions on what weapons to deploy. Now, if you apply that to a nuclear command and control center, I think we all understood AI times nuclear. That's dangerous. Also could be used in biological research. The threat there is if AI invents a new pathogen, like a new virus that we can't cure. And also, thirdly, in the information space, AI is undermining the fact, according to the report, the fact-based conversations that need to be had to address these threats. Okay, how worried are you about AI?
I think those are fantastic analyses. When I was reading over the report and the bulletin, I looked at these, and I'm very impressed that they located different scenarios by which AI, if it's not under the kind of multilateral control that we truly need for the types of treaties that my colleagues here are discussing, AI can be very much the same issue. Not because AI in and of itself will magically turn into Terminator. That's an absurd claim that's being pushed out a lot by tech magnates to block us away from the real scenarios by which AI can create and develop and amplify existential risk. So all three of these scenarios are relevant. Let's start with the last one. We as human beings, and definitely here in the United States and in many societies, including liberal democratic ones, are more polarized, we're more fragmented than ever, because as we all know, social media gives us very different lenses into the world and disconnects us from shared senses of reality, let alone shared senses of truth. You know, God bless Al Jazeera, but many journalists are on the chopping block right now, and social media has essentially eroded and fragmented journalism. So AI, which is, can dynamically create content to psychographically, target someone, create content to influence Cyril's neuroticism around this topic or that topic, rather than just demographic targeting. AI can create content to manipulate and fragment us. But the other two are very important. They are scenarios by which AI can be applied to large bodies of data to essentially come out with decisions that might be better for its ultimately optimized goal, no matter what the costs are. So if you tell an AI, no matter what, protect the United States in the case of some nuclear proliferation, it may take choices that create mass destruction and may not calculate the long-term risk to the United States. So in that sense, it could push the clock even forward. So there are many different examples of AI, because you should just understand AI as a set of rules and bodies using pattern recognition to large body data. But it needs to be instructed in the image of multilateralism and our best selves as human beings around the planet.
Okay, several of you have mentioned multilateralism, so it's time we got to it. I'm going to have to skip the climate change part, which is also referenced as a major threat to the world. But I do want to leave a few minutes to address, how this gets addressed, right? Because that actually is the point of the Doomsday Clock. They say it's not just to scare people, it is to signal a level of urgency to us as human beings so that discussions can be had and decisions can be made. Ben, after World War II, the world essentially came together and created a set of global clubs so that we can fix the world's biggest problems and most pressing threats, right? So you have the United Nations Security Council, you have the World Health Organization to address climate change, you have the Paris Accords, and just those clubs aren't functioning largely because the world's main superpower, the US, has pulled out of most of them and doesn't believe in them and is defunding them. And so the direction of travel is that we're no longer solving problems jointly. How worried are you about that?
Well, again, extremely, and it comes back to specifics, as you say. I mean, following the Second World War, the UN was established. The UN Charter signed off in 1945. That was supposed to define fundamental rights such as the integrity, the sovereignty of nations. And it's all being thrown out the window bit by bit. And we can point to Trump, and I think Trump is symptomatic of this. I mean, he's not the cause of it. But what he's doing is undoing the international rules-based order that we've had since 1945. And that's also being driven by the enormous changes that are going on in the world, because it used to be the West was in charge, and all these bodies like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, they all sit in the States because it was the West that was in charge and leading these things and promoting these values. But what we've seen going on in the last decade or so is all the emerging markets are coming up extremely fast. And it's boiled down to this row between the unipolar world, which was the established order led by the states, and what people like Xi Jinping and Putin are calling the multipolar world. And they want their seat at the table. And this is producing tensions across the board and also undermining the international order. We've got the war in Ukraine as one example. We've got the threat of China and its aggressive economic attack in things like EVs. I mean, it's taking one technology after another. And without this international values at the base of it, then it's all becoming unmanageable because it goes back to a might makes right policy. And this is where Trump comes in and catalyzes that, because he specifically pushes that. We've seen him use military force in Venezuela. We've seen him threaten Greenland, an EU member, with an invasion because he wants the resources. But it goes beyond that. I mean, you mentioned yourself, the Peace Council. That's another example. The Peace Council is specifically designed to undermine the authority of the UN. He's trying to give himself another conflict resolution international organization. The difference being is that he's the chairman and he has a personal veto over it, which is not the way. We don't need a peace council. We already have the UN. It serves that function. And I just see these things continuing. In the meantime, the emerging markets or the global south are trying to club together and produce new bodies. But we have this sort of chaotic patchwork of organizations now where the old ones don't have any power anymore and the new ones are too young and inexperienced to be effective. And in that chaotic situation that you get all of these problems, these dangers, the fact that someone gets into a row and might use a nuclear weapon, like the row between Russia and Ukraine, where the use of a nuclear weapon now is a real possibility. And it's all fundamentally destabilizing, hence the clock ticking closer to midnight.
And we have about 85 seconds left to the end of the show. So, Karim, I'm going to have to make this the last one. If you could make one policy change or recommend one policy change, what would it be?
Getting back urgently to a system that would control nuclear weapons and using the Doomsday Clock as a sign of that urgency. So now we have a situation in which the dangers associated with these weapons are increasing, even though the overall number of nuclear weapons has actually decreased. So from a high point of around 60,000 during the 1980s to around 12,200 that we have today. So we actually have less nuclear weapons. But the dangers of the use of even one nuclear weapon has increased. So we need to get back on a very urgent basis to a serious arms control agenda to put limitations on the most dangerous weapons that pose existential risk to the planet as a whole.
And with that, I'd like to thank all our guests for joining us on Inside Story today, Karim Haggag, Ramesh Srinivasan, and Ben Aris. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril Vanier, and the whole team here, bye for now.